everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing something very exciting here. I am going to be trying to make macarons for the very first time. I've been very hesitant to make them, even though I've kind of been gathering materials to help me in their creation for the last 2 years, but I figured as part of my overall channel goal for this year of having a more cohesive Lolita lifestyle, this would be the perfect thing to try and bake. I'll move you guys in a little bit. Hopefully this will look okay. As you can see, I kind of have a galley kitchen, so there's not a ton of room to move around in, but hopefully everything will go okay and you'll be able to see all of the steps I'm going to take in making these. In terms of recipes, I'm going to be using Binging with Babish's recipe for the base macarons, and then another recipe for the French buttercream. But anyway, yeah, we have all our materials laid out, so let's get right on into it. Starting out, I measured out the almond flour and powdered sugar with my kitchen scale. I then mixed it together lightly and poured it into a sifter, and then sifted it into a second bowl. Since the recipe calls for the dry items to be blended in a food processor, and I don't have one of those, I had the idea of using a coffee grinder instead. So I just had to pour the mixture into smaller batches into the coffee grinder and whiz it around for 10 seconds at a time. Once it had all gone through the grinder, I transferred the mixture into the sifter again and sifted it into the smaller bowl. I wanted to show you the texture of the dry ingredients before and after being sifted. So the first is the unsifted and unprocessed version, which is more like sand, whereas the sifted and grinded version is more like kinetic sand in that it's more soft and not as grainy. Now moving on to the wet ingredients, I used the scale again to measure out the sugar and the egg whites. I did not do a good job of cracking the eggs at first and separating the egg whites without getting it all over my hands, but eventually I was able to pass the egg yolk between the shells. With just the egg whites in the bowl, I took my hand mixer and started to froth the eggs. Once they were bubbling, I started to gradually add in the sugar. Now this step took a very long time, and I definitely think if you have a stand mixer, you will save yourself a lot of physical pain by not having to stand over the mixing bowl for 10 minutes. When you start to see the pathway left by the mixer with all those lines, you know that you are making good progress. I also like to tilt the bowl to the side so I get a lot of the liquid hitting the blades of the mixer. It was very slow going, but eventually the eggs did become a stiff peaked meringue. At this point I stopped the mixer and added in the rose extract that I'm using as flavoring and the pink food coloring to the mix, and continued to whip the eggs around for an additional minute. From here we get to the step that's considered the hardest part of making macarons, which is folding in the batter. To do this, you add about 1/3 of the dry ingredients to the meringue and sort of swipe along the outside, cutting through the center and pulling the meringue on top of the dry ingredients until it is all incorporated. Then you can add the rest of the dry ingredients, which I decided to sift through one last time, and continue to fold the dry ingredients into the meringue. I feel like I may have underfolded this, but the resulting issues I had with my macarons are usually a sign of overfolding, so I'm not really sure what went down. I think next time I will try counting, as people say usually between 50 and 60 folds is the sweet spot for a perfect batter. From here I piped out the macarons, and I would be lying to you if I said this was easy. I overfilled my piping bag a lot, and I had a lot of trouble with the initial set of macarons, but it did get easier over time. I was also using a silicone piping bag for the first time, and there was definitely a learning curve that I did not expect. I definitely know now what not to do when I make these again. I think this is where I made one of my biggest errors, which is that I forgot to smack the pan to release air bubbles, and I don't think I let the macarons rest for long enough to develop a thick enough shell. Taking them out of the oven, I noticed some of them had caved in and cracked, but others at least initially had stayed smooth, and they pretty much all had feet, which in my eyes is a sign that at least my batter for the most part was good. For the buttercream, I will link the recipe I used, and I did add the pink food coloring and rose flavor and piped it onto the macarons with a small silicone icing pen. And then they were all done. Okay, so it's been a day, and here are all of the ones that we turned into sandwiches. We did eat quite a few of the super cracked flat ones, but these were all of the ones that had enough of a presentable top to turn into their final product. I've yet to eat them in this final stage because I wanted to wait a day, because I know you're supposed to let the flavor develop overnight. These are super icy from being in the fridge, but hopefully they'll still be good. I think I'll eat this guy. He's a little bit uneven. The bottom cookie's a little bit larger and he's pretty cracked, but hopefully the flavor will still be good. So let's go ahead and try. So the inside, I think, is how it's supposed to look like. It's chewy, the outside has a little bit of a crunch, and the flavor of the rose is really pronounced. I I'm always hesitant about putting a really, really small amount of extract into things because I'm like, how could a half a teaspoon make that much of a difference? But it really does make a difference. I can definitely taste the rose flavor. I think despite being a little ugly with its shell, it still does have the overall feeling of a regular macaron. Okay, so I wanted to give some tips that I had just from my overall experience of making these guys. Number one is definitely where things started to go wrong, and that is with piping out the macarons. I definitely think you should only fill your pastry bag halfway at a time so you don't have a lot spurting out the top, and you really have a lot of control with the lower section as you pipe it out into the perfect circles. I do think having the mats that I was using was very helpful because they gave me a really good idea of what the guidelines should be for how large I should make the macarons to make sure they would all be relatively the same size. Next is I think that tapping on the counter to smack out all the air bubbles is absolutely a must because otherwise your macarons will have a really hecked up, cracked look on the top of them. I also did mine all on one cookie sheet, but I think two would have been better because then I could have had the first set done, smacked, and drying while I worked on perfecting the second set. As with the smacking out the air bubbles, drying them out, I did not realize how important it was to the process, and I would say in the future I'm probably going to dry them out for at least an hour to make sure I have a really thick shell. Some places I saw said 30 minutes, some places I saw said 45. I ended up doing like 35 just because that was sort of what my schedule was like for the afternoon. I thought that would be a good time to put them in, and it definitely was not long enough. I definitely should have gone for at least an hour. And I think the lack of the smacking of the air bubbles, coupled with them not having enough time to dry out, sort of overall led to the issue of them having the cracked shell on top. I also am not really sure if my macarons are overcooked or undercooked. I did them for the 12 minutes initially, and then I took them out, thought that they maybe were underdone, and I put them back in for another 3 minutes because I had seen a maximum of 15 for most recipes. But I think that taking them out and putting them back in maybe also aided in them being really like sticky and hard to whip off of the sheets in the end. I definitely think whatever time you decide to go for them, you should just commit to it and then take them out once you think they're done and then leave them out. I don't think that you should take them out, be unsure, and then put them back in. You can take them out to check them, but if you let them wait and start to cool down and then put them back in the oven, it's going to make it really difficult to pull them off of the parchment paper or mats that you're using. I think once I saw that they had the feet, I should have just known that they would have been done and set enough to take them out at 12 minutes, and I probably would not have had as many casualties in pulling them off the mats as I ended up having. Another tip I think would be great is if you have two people working on this, because that way someone can work on the laborious task of doing the dry ingredients and the laborious task of doing the wet ingredients at the same time, because I think that will definitely cut down on the amount of time you're taking working on these guys. It took me like an hour to prep everything, but it would have taken me 30 minutes if I had someone else working on the other half of the ingredients at the same time as I was. Also, having a stand mixer would definitely be helpful, but obviously they're very expensive, and a hand mixer is all I've got in this tiny apartment, so I'm going to keep working with what I have. Overall, I am really happy, especially since this is my first attempt, especially like some of these guys in the center are like my crown jewels in terms of how good they came out. I know that my batter is good and that my method of using the coffee grinder definitely worked because the areas that are smooth and uncracked in don't have a grainy texture to them, which means that I did sift through the dry ingredients enough. It just was those last couple steps that I didn't take into full account how important they would be that led to the downfall of the overall appearance of these. But I know from the overall texture when I'm eating them, as well as the presence of the feet, that they were really close to being perfect, even for my first attempt. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please let me know in the comment sections if you did, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!